Well, it's been a difficult week in Manchester, in England. The act of terror that took 22 innocent lives was quite horrendous. On Tuesday, as families and friends were struggling to come to grips with that loss and the injuries, the players of one of the city's soccer teams flew out to Stockholm for a major European final. And some of the players were saying that in the face of such a great act of terror, a game of football was nothing. And yet they went out and they won the game, and several of them said that they did it for Manchester and for the victims of terrorism. Well, as a lifelong supporter of this team, Manchester United, I have to say that it was very, very mixed emotions about that particular trophy. And I posted on Facebook that the whole thing just felt bittersweet in light of what had happened. Now, I may not have lived in Manchester in my lifetime, but because United have always been my team, I've thought about Manchester pretty well every day since I was about 8 years old. And most of that has to do with football, of course. You're going to hear that word from me, football, as opposed to soccer. You just have to tolerate it, I'm afraid. But I mean the game you play with your feet. You know, I would think mostly about soccer, about who's in form, who's injured, what the prospects are for the next game. And it was probably about 5 years ago that Manchester United played one of their summer games, their warm-up games in Toronto. And I went along with one of my friends and colleagues, Andrew Sterling, and we decided we'd drive in a bit early and get a bite to eat and then watch the players warm up for the warm-up game and you know, make it a full sort of afternoon and evening. And as we got out of the car, Andrew reached into his bag and he pulled out a cap that said Manchester United on it. And then as we were walking along, he reached into his bag again and he pulled out another cap that said Manchester United on it. He didn't want me to be left out. And there we were with these caps on, walking over to the Rogers Centre. And we weren't alone because it seemed that everybody there were wearing caps. And it's just like we had a big sign on our foreheads. We're supporting Manchester United. And there were 46,000 people approximately that went to that game. And of the 46,000, about 40,000 turned out to be Manchester United fans, and so they're all wearing red caps and scarves and things like that. And the other poor fellows, the Glasgow Celtic, I was really surprised. I thought there'd be more of them, but there were only about 6,000 Celtic supporters in that game, and they're wearing green and white. They play in green and white hoops. And everybody had this sign. They had a cap or a scarf or whatever, and you just knew where their loyalties lay. We were in the section of the Rogers Centre that was just almost completely red and white and a little bit of black. And so that was a Manchester United section. I felt sorry for the two Glasgow Celtic supporters that were sitting right in front of us in this huge sea of red, and they're wearing their signs, and people are talking about them under their breath sort of thing. And when Celtic came out onto the field, these poor people, they couldn't even celebrate because they're sitting in the red section. Well, okay, I'm taking this off. That sign. You know, we encounter signs everywhere. There are signs on the streets, there are signs on buildings, there are signs that people wear that tell us things about them, about maybe what sport they like, what team they like, what's important to them. I was thinking that a ring, for instance, can tell us things about people. If people wear a ring on the third finger of the left hand, that means that a person is married, unless you're Dutch. And I just had to check on this one before the service, so that's why the choir's laughing. I knew this, but just had to check. If you're Dutch, you wear a wedding ring on the right hand, an engagement ring on the left hand. So a little different, but if you live in Holland, you understand that. But for most of the Western world, a ring on the left hand, on that third finger, says you're married. Other rings, they tell us that someone's a Mason, or that someone's won the Stanley Cup, or in my case, a Claddagh, that there's some Irish connection here. Sometimes people can wear things that tell us what religion they are. If there's a thing on someone's head, you've kind of got an idea that they're Sikh. If a person wears a cross, well, that we have to give up on that one, because that's become more of a fashion item than a sign these days. But still, signs are everywhere. And I couldn't help but think that as I read that passage in John's Gospel during the week, that Jesus is giving us a sign. And it's a sure sign of Christian faith, Christian life. He says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. So the commandments are like a sign that we have faith, or we love Jesus Christ. If you love me, says Jesus. Love comes in all sorts of forms. I ran into a person last week, and there was a song being played on the radio, and she said, "Oh, I love that song." It was that Happy song from a few years ago by Pharrell Williams. What is it? Clap along. You want to sing it? No. I'm not sure we can quite get the beat. But happy. People love songs, and will say that they love a song, and that generally means they really like something. Love can be romantic, and people talk about falling in love. I remember one of the first movies that I went to see as a young person without parents around was a movie called Love Story with Ryan O'Neal and Ali McGraw. And I went with some high school friends, and we were all about 13 years old, and the girls picked this one. And there were just two guys, and I was one of them. And it was a really interesting story about a couple that fall in love, and there's this deep bond, and they're dealing with parental attitudes that don't want to see them together, and yet they remain true. And then tragedy strikes as the young woman fell ill, and ultimately sadness in this love story as the character played by Ali McGraw passed away. And there were many people in the theater, I remember, particularly the girls, with tears coming down their faces. And love can be associated with romance, and not every romance will end happily ever after. But love can also be something else. Love can be something even deeper. Maybe it's a part of falling in love, but even deeper, it can be more concrete. There was a couple in my last congregation a few years ago who asked me once if I'd seen the film Frozen. And I hadn't had young children around the house for quite a while. Mine are adults, and so I had to say, no, I haven't seen Frozen. But in Frozen, they gave me a copy of it and insisted that I watch it, and I did. And in Frozen, there's this deep, deep love felt between two sisters that is a part of that plot. And there are two princesses, Elsa and Anna, and the older sister, Elsa, has these cryokinetic powers, and she can turn things into ice. and snow very quickly. But Elsa can't really control these powers too well, and one day she hurts Anna, and she sort of zaps her in the heart, and Anna's whole body is beginning to freeze. It's beginning to freeze very, very slowly. Her friend, Christoph, he knows that she needs help, and so he takes her to the Troll King, who knows about these things. And the Troll King tells them that Anna's frozen heart can only be thawed by an act of true love. And I won't tell you the whole story, but towards the end, there's a scene in which the sister Elsa is being attacked by the evil Hans, and he wanted to rule the kingdom. It's potentially Anna's last breath. She sees the attack coming and jumps in between Hans and Elsa, and she's about to be totally frozen, but in doing this, and jumping in between, she stops Hans, she stops the attack, and Elsa is saved. And of course, this is an act of sacrifice, an act of true love between the sisters. And the spell was undone, and Anna's heart then began to thaw, and in this case, they lived happily ever after. And so love, when we think about love, it can be so many different things, but it can be some emotional feeling, it can be falling in love, it can be also an action. And we see these things in the church as well. We see, I've seen, and perhaps you have, maybe on television, a service, a Christian service, and you'll see some people singing an old hymn or even a more contemporary song, and their hands will be out, and they're feeling this, and they're singing this song from within themselves. I've seen that in the choir too sometimes, as our choir sings. They feel the music and the songs, and so there can be love in the church. That's an emotive feeling, a love for a song. There's love for God too in the church. Like falling in love, there are some people who will give themselves over to God. In other traditions, like the Anglo-Catholic tradition or the Catholic tradition, they have orders and monasteries and convents where people will just give themselves over to God in an act of devotion. And maybe in our tradition, in the Reformed Protestant tradition, there are people who will go to retreats and will go into acts of devotion to sort of search for God and to encounter the deep mysteries of God. And so you've got that there as well, this sort of falling in love. But when we really think about Jesus and love, we have to think of the cross. And we have to think of Jesus' act of sacrifice. And so for Jesus, love is an act. And I think this is what he's getting at here with us. He makes love in this passage in John concrete. And he says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. It's an act. And now generally, when it comes to commandments, it's not a popular theme these days. You know, all those do's and don'ts and thou shalt nots, people aren't too keen on them. They think that it might sort of ruin their day, curtail their lives, stop all the fun. And for decades now, if you think about it, the church has turned its focus away from commandments to things like grace and love. And yet, if we read Matthew's gospel, for instance, we'll encounter Jesus, who says, I have not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And he goes even further with the law. He radicalizes it. He'll say things like, you've heard it said, thou shalt not kill. But I say to you, whoever's angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother shall be liable to the council. Whoever calls his brother a fool shall be liable to the hell of fire. And I think that goes for sisters as well. Jesus takes the commandments and radicalizes them. He talks about adultery and says, even looking at a person lustfully is committing adultery in your heart. He talks about love and loving your neighbor. And he says, hey, anybody can love their neighbor. What about your enemy? Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Simple, but not easy. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And here's a question. How are we doing with that? You know, there are people in the church today who are beginning to question the church and wonder if the church is really being the church. And some people are suggesting that the church used to stand for things, but it's not anymore. And they think we've become part of the culture and not different. No defining values, no moral edge. There is a sociologist named Reginald Bibby, and he's done studies on this kind of thing. And a few years ago, he did a study where he examined the direction of people in general vis-a-vis people in the church. And he had sort of 72 different categories. And of the 72 different categories, 68 he found there was no appreciable difference between how Christians acted and how the general population acted. I used to have small groups that I ran, and in one of them, I remember one evening, the issue of sin kept coming up again and again. And several people in the group were asking about it, and basically the thought was going, what's happened to the church and sin? And the church's understanding of it. Has it changed? Has sin changed? You know, what's happening? What was happening 30 or 40 or 50 years ago? That doesn't seem to be, there are things there that don't seem to be sin anymore. And they're asking why? And does sin change? Basically, they're asking, how are we supposed to live? And in answering it, I wondered, I'd had this thought for quite a while. I've wondered if the church has been on something like a pendulum. And in one era, the Victorian era, and maybe the first half of the 20th century, it swung too far in one direction. Became so interested in the commandments of God and living just so that it became legalistic. And things like love were missed. And then the 60s came along, and the 70s, and that all changed. And the pendulum began to swing in a different direction. And everybody wanted to cast off the silliness and the burdens of legalism, and everybody was talking about love and grace. And the pendulum swung the other way. And I've wondered now if we've swung so far that we've forgotten that Jesus does have some ideals for us, and that how we live is important to God. And maybe that pendulum has swung to the point where people are asking today, they're looking at how Christians live in the world, and they're saying, are we really living as Christ called us to live? And maybe as people are waking up, this pendulum starting back the other way, and we're going to find that center in which love and grace and Christian values all meet. A good friend of mine, Dr. John Patrick, he and his wife Sally used to live in Ottawa. Now they're south of Ottawa. But each year they went to Central Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, the Congo. John, his specialty in the medical field was nutrition, and he went there to work on nutrition in that region. And John and Sally, they were also very strong Christians, and they sought not only to help people physically, but spiritually. And they weren't part of the Free Methodist movement in Central Africa, but they were aware of what was going on there, and we were talking about it one day. And the extent of the Free Methodist Church's work in Africa was really strong. In Rwanda, for instance, they had hundreds of thousands of people who considered themselves Christian and Free Methodist, and so much so that the bishop of that region became so important that he's invited to a lot of presidential functions and that sort of thing. But John said this about Christianity in that part of the world, and I remember it very well. He said, "David, I pray for the African Christians because their Christianity is a mile wide and an inch deep." And he went on to talk about how their faith really hadn't been integrated and didn't affect how they lived. And then, if you'll remember, along came that terrible, terrible genocide in 1994. And 1 million people are thought to have died in that. And there were Christians within that denomination, that faith, that lived above that terrible fray. But there are also those whose faith was an inch deep and were caught up in the struggle. Living without deep Christian values, see, it can lead to some things, and some things we don't like. If you love me, you will keep my commandments, says Jesus. And he actually calls us to a very deep, radical faith that's different than what's commonly accepted by our culture. None of us want to get back to the legalism over here. And yet Jesus calls us to live somewhere with, it's another level. And I sometimes wonder if we've forgotten, if we've let the love and the grace influence our thoughts so much that we don't think about what happens after we receive God's grace. I think Jesus said something about the gate being narrow and the road narrow that leads to eternal life. And the challenge is for us to find that road. And I would encourage you to think about the Scriptures and make it a part of life, because in there you'll find things. You might want to take a look at 1 Peter or 1 John or Colossians or the Gospels and see maybe God has something more complex for us, a more complex way to live. And then when you find it, I would encourage you to wear it like a badge of faith, a sign to others, a sign that you follow Christ. Let's pray. Gracious God, we are thankful for the faith that has come our way, the faith that we've been called to, the faith that is ours in Jesus Christ. We thank you for your grace and the fact that it has come to even us, because each one of us has not always walked with you. And so we thank you for the opportunity to have faith, but also for your Spirit that helps us to live as you would have us live. Lord, help us to be a sign. Help us to be signs to others that we truly follow you. And perhaps in that, May they see Jesus. Amen.